You hit Earth first. Now we are coming for you, the woman general warned the Empire. The first thing I heard was the sound of the sky tearing open. Not an explosion, not an alarm. A tear, like the universe itself had been pulled apart at a seam, and then the light came, so white and so total, that for a moment I thought I had gone blind. I was standing at my desk on the 4th floor of the Strategic Analysis Building in New Reykjavik, when the window in front of me turned into a wall of fire, and the wall picked me up and threw me through 3 internal partitions before the ceiling came down, and the world went dark and quiet. I do not know how long I was unconscious. When I woke up, I was buried under 2 feet of concrete and a desk that had somehow protected my head. My ears were ringing with a sound like the inside of a bell. My left arm was pinned. My mouth tasted like metal and dust. I could see a narrow triangle of orange light to my left, which meant fire, and a thin column of gray sky above me, which meant the roof was gone. I worked my arm free. It took a long time. I do not remember feeling pain, which I understand now is what happens when the body decides that pain is not the priority. The priority is moving. The priority is air. I crawled toward the gray sky column and I came up through the rubble into a world that I did not recognize. New Reykjavik was a city of 4 million people. It had a harbor and a university, and a transit system that ran underground, and 7 hospitals and a famous outdoor market that sold fish and old books side by side. I had eaten at a restaurant 2 blocks from the Strategic Analysis Building the night before, a small place with red chairs and a window that looked out onto the canal. None of that existed anymore. As far as I could see in every direction, there was rubble and fire and a thick column of gray-brown smoke rising into the sky. The canal was still there, but the water in it was boiling. The university tower, which had been 40 stories tall and visible from almost every part of the city, was simply gone. Not fallen, gone. As if it had never been built. Where the outdoor market had been, there was a crater so wide and deep that I could not see the bottom from where I was standing. I want to be honest about what I felt in those first minutes. I did not feel rage. I did not feel grief. I felt a very clean, very cold kind of shock. The kind that makes everything sharp and simple. I felt myself counting. I counted the columns of smoke I could see from where I stood. I counted 7. Then I stopped counting because there were too many. The Vorkai had announced their presence to humanity 11 months earlier. Their ships had appeared at the edge of our solar system, with the casual confidence of people who had done this many times before, and their first transmission to Earth had been a list of conditions rather than a greeting. They called themselves the Vorkai Stellar Empire, and they informed us, in precise and translated language, that our interstellar probe, the one we had launched 16 years ago and named after a river in South America, had crossed into a zone of space they considered exclusively theirs. They had sent no warning when the probe crossed that line. They had simply noted the violation in a file somewhere and decided what to do about it. What they decided was this. I learned the rest of what happened that day from the feeds that came in over the next 48 hours, pieced together from satellites and ground stations, and the handful of people in other parts of the world who had been watching the sky at the right moment. The Vorkai had not sent a fleet. They had sent 4 ships. 4 ships to a planet of 12 billion people, because 4 ships was apparently enough. And they were not wrong about that, not technically. 4 ships had descended to the upper atmosphere above New Reykjavik and released a single coordinated strike that had converted a living city into a flat, smoking plain of fused earth and broken stone in less than 90 seconds. The transmission they sent afterward was brief. It acknowledged the strike. It described it as a measured response to our unauthorized territorial incursion. It stated that further incursions, including any military response by Earth to the current action, would result in additional measured responses. It named 7 other cities, 1 on each inhabited continent, as future targets if compliance was not immediate and total. It demanded unconditional surrender and formal acknowledgement of Vorkai territorial authority over all space, beyond the boundary of our solar system. It gave us 30 days. Then the 4 ships left. I was sitting on a piece of broken wall when General Mara Osei arrived. I did not know who she was at first. I saw a convoy of military vehicles moving carefully through the rubble, and I saw a woman step out of the lead vehicle and stand very still at the edge of what had been the main plaza. She was tall and broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark uniform without decoration, and she wore no helmet. Her hair was short and gray at the temples. She stood there and she looked at what she was seeing, and she did not move for a long time. I counted. It was 12 seconds. I counted because counting was what I did, and because I did not know what else to do with my hands and my brain, and the fact that I was alive in a place where almost no one else was. Then she turned to the group of officers who had followed her out of the vehicles, and she said something to them in a voice I was too far away to hear clearly. One of the officers, a young man named Colin Price, told me later what she had said. She had looked at what remained of New Reykjavik, and she had said, quietly, to herself as much as to them, "Good. Now we know exactly what they are." Her name was Mara Osei. She was 61 years old. She had been born in Accra and educated in London, and she had spent the previous 30 years working in planetary defense, which until 11 months ago had been a job that mostly involved planning for asteroid deflection and solar weather events. She had no experience with war against another civilization, because no one on Earth had that experience. No one in human history had ever needed it. She had requested to be sent to New Reykjavik within 2 hours of the strike. She had been told it was not safe. She had said that she was aware of that and asked again. She was in the air within the hour. One of her aides found me sitting on my piece of broken wall and asked if I was the analyst from the Strategic Analysis Building. I said I was, or I had been. He told me to come with him. I came. I did not ask why. It did not seem like a moment for questions. I was assigned to General Osei's staff that evening, in a temporary command center set up in a cargo facility at the northern edge of the city, one of the few structures that had remained standing. There were 17 of us, analysts and communications officers, and 2 people I later understood to be from the intelligence services, though they never said so directly. Osei stood at the center of the room and told us what was going to happen. She said that the Vorkai expected compliance. She said that they had done this before, to other worlds, and that the pattern was consistent. A single demonstration of overwhelming force, followed by a demand, followed by acceptance. She said that every civilization the Vorkai had encountered up to this point had accepted. She said that this made sense, because the alternative was more demonstrations, and more demonstrations meant more cities, and more cities meant more people, and most civilizations, when they understood that the choice was between their pride and their people, chose their people. She paused there. She looked around the room at each of us in turn. She was not a person who looked at things carelessly. When she looked at you, you understood that she was actually seeing you, not just the space you occupied. She said that we were going to do something different. She did not say it loudly. She did not make a speech. She said it the way you would say that you intended to take a different route home from work, as a simple statement of a decision that had already been made and did not require debate. The next morning, Earth's 7 separate military organizations, which had spent the previous decade arguing about jurisdiction and funding and whose satellites were whose, held an emergency joint session and voted to consolidate under a single unified command structure. The vote was not unanimous, but it was fast, which was more important. The unified command was called the Allied Terran Coalition. Its supreme commander, by a vote of 6-1, was Mara Osei. The Vorkai sent their surrender demand again on day 7. They sent it again on day 15. They sent it again on day 28. No one replied to any of them. The silence from Earth was complete and deliberate, and I understood, sitting in the temporary command center with its flickering lights and its smell of dust and cold coffee, that the silence itself was the message. We were not begging for time. We were not preparing a surrender document. We were not afraid. We were preparing something else entirely. I walked back to the edge of the crater where the outdoor market had been, on the evening of the 30th day. The Vorkai deadline was 6 hours away. The sky above me was clear and very dark, and I could see stars, and somewhere out there among those stars were the 47 worlds of the Vorkai stellar empire, and their fleets, and their certainty that what they had done here was reasonable and finished. I thought about the restaurant with the red chairs. I thought about the fish and old books. I thought about a city of 4 million people who had been living their lives on the night before the sky tore open, and I thought about what Mara Osei had said in that cargo facility, in her quiet, certain voice. We are going to do something different. I looked at the stars for a long time. Then I went back to work. The Vorkai deadline came and went like a stone dropped into still water. No explosion, no announcement, no fleet arriving in our sky to deliver the next demonstration. Just silence, and then more silence, and then a second demand that arrived 4 days later in the same flat, translated tone as the first, this time with a longer list of consequences, and then silence again, when we did not answer that one either. I have thought about this moment many times since. I think the Vorkai were confused by our silence, in a way they did not have the language to describe. They had a process. Their process had always worked. When the process stopped working, they did not immediately reach for escalation. They reached for patience, because patience to them meant the same thing it had always meant in their long history of expansion. It meant, eventually, the weaker party will understand its position. They did not understand that we were counting on that. The 30 years that followed the day they hit New Reykjavik were not years of suffering and despair, though there was suffering and there was despair. They were years of the most focused, most disciplined, most quietly furious work that any civilization has ever done in secret. I know this because I was part of it. I watched it happen from the inside, first as an analyst on Osei's staff, then as her head of strategic planning, then, eventually, as the person she trusted most to hold the whole architecture of what we were building in my head, and tell her when something was wrong. What we were building was not just a military force. Let me explain what that means, because I think people who read about this period later tend to imagine a simple story. Humanity built a lot of ships and trained a lot of soldiers and then attacked. That is the outline of it, but the outline misses the thing that actually made it work. What Osei understood, from those first 12 seconds she spent looking at the rubble of New Reykjavik, was that we could not beat the Vorkai by being a bigger version of what we already were. We were one world, they were 47. One world does not beat 47 worlds by building more weapons of the same kind. We had to become something the Vorkai had never encountered. In the first 5 years, the work was almost entirely underground. Not literally, though some of it was. The asteroid mining programs that had been slowly expanding for the previous decade were redirected without public announcement. The processing facilities that had been turning raw ore into structural materials for the new Martian colony stations were quietly retooled. The engineers who understood how to work in vacuum and extreme cold and without any of the support systems that people on Earth took for granted were recruited and moved and given tasks that were described, in official documents, as infrastructure development. The official documents were not inaccurate. We were building infrastructure. We were just not building the kind of infrastructure anyone outside our circle was meant to understand. By year 7, we had dry dock capacity in the asteroid belt, large enough to construct vessels 3 times the size of anything in our existing fleet. By year 10, we had a new generation of propulsion systems that had been developed by 6 separate research teams working in parallel, each team knowing only their own part of the problem. By year 12, we had a working prototype of what we called the Deep Lance, a weapon system built around a concept so simple that our engineers were initially embarrassed they had not thought of it sooner. It used nothing we had not already known how to do. It combined 4 existing technologies in a sequence that the Vorkai had never tried because, we later learned, they did not think in terms of combinations, they thought in terms of components. This was a difference that turned out to matter enormously. The children who had been born in the year the Vorkai hit New Reykjavik were now teenagers. They grew up knowing the star charts of the Vorkai Empire the way children in previous centuries had grown up knowing the geography of their own countries. They studied Vorkai military doctrine not as an academic subject but as a practical one, the way you study the habits of something you intend to face one day and need to understand completely. They were not raised on anger. Anger is unstable, and it burns itself out. They were raised on something quieter and more durable. They were raised on purpose. I remember a conversation I had with Osei in year 14, in her office aboard the station we called the Frame, which was the central command structure we had built into a hollowed asteroid in the outer belt. She was sitting at her desk reading a report, and I was standing by the observation port looking out at the construction activity around us, the slow and enormous work of making something that had never existed before. I said to her that I was worried about the pace. There were things that were taking longer than our models had predicted, and there were resource constraints that we had not fully anticipated, and I wanted to talk about whether we needed to revise the timeline. She put down the report and looked at me, and she said, What does the timeline need to be? I said I was not sure. 12 more years, maybe 15, to be fully ready. She said, then it is 12 more years. I said that was not a plan. That was just accepting whatever happened. She said, no, it is deciding that we will be ready when we are ready, and not before, and not asking anyone's permission for that. The Vorkai are not going anywhere. Their certainty is our best protection. Every day they believe we are complying is a day we use. All of it. That was the other thing she understood that I had to learn. The Empire's arrogance was not a problem to be worked around. It was a resource to be spent carefully. In year 16, Ose made the contact that changed everything. The Shen Vok were a species from a system 200 light-years from Earth. They were insect-like in their physical structure, highly organized, extraordinarily precise in their thinking, and they had been subjects of the Vorkai Empire for 80 years. They were not enslaved, not technically. The Vorkai did not use that word, and did not run things in that way. What the Vorkai did was absorb. They absorbed worlds into their empire, and those worlds continued to exist and their populations continued to live and work, but their resources, their space, their decisions about the future all flowed upward, to the center, to the Vorkai conclave. The Shenvok had been producing and delivering raw materials to the Vorkai for 8 decades, and they would continue to do so for as long as the empire existed. Ose had spent years identifying Shenvok communication signals that did not go through official Vorkai channels. It had taken enormous patience and the work of several people who understood signal analysis at a level I could only appreciate from a distance. When the first direct contact was made, it was through a sequence of mathematical pulses embedded in what looked like stellar noise, sent and received over 18 months before anyone on either side was confident that the other side was actually there. The Shenvok response, when it finally came in a form we could fully decode, contained 2 things. The first was a detailed map of Vorkai supply chain vulnerabilities that they had spent 40 years cataloging and had no means to use. The second was a question, translated across a bridge of mathematics and physics, and the assumption that intelligence tends to think in similar shapes regardless of what shape the intelligence comes in. The question was, are you actually fighting back, or are you just hoping? Ose dictated the reply herself. It was 3 words. We are building. The Orindi joined 2 years later. They were a species the Vorkai had encountered 30 years before us, and they had done what all the others had done before. They had surrendered. But they had never stopped watching, and they had never stopped thinking. And when they learned through the Shenvak network that there was a new world, a young and apparently foolish world, that had refused the Vorkai demand, and gone silent, and had been silent now for 18 years, they reached out through the same quiet channels with an offer. They had ships, old ones, not militarily significant on their own, but they had pilots who had been flying those ships for 30 years in Vorkai space, who knew the patrol routes and the response times and the gaps in coverage that existed, because the Vorkai, in their certainty, had stopped looking carefully at the things they were sure they controlled. We were not one world building against 47 anymore. In year 23, the Vorkai sent an inspection fleet to our system. They did this, we later learned from Shenvak intelligence, not because they suspected anything specific, but because it was procedure. Every absorbed or surrendered civilization received a periodic inspection to verify compliance with resource allocation agreements. We had agreed to nothing and signed nothing, but we had also not formally refused. And somewhere in the Vorkai administrative structure, our file had been placed in a category that generated an inspection order on a 23-year cycle. Ose was informed about the fleet the moment it appeared at the edge of our system. She called me into her office and told me. I said, "What do we do?" She said, "Nothing." I said, "They will detect the construction in the belt." She said, "No, they will detect what I allow them to detect. Have the outer facilities run their agricultural protocols for the next 6 days. Everything else goes dark." I said that if they came close enough, they would detect the mass signatures. She said, "They will not come close enough. They never do. They are not inspecting us because they are suspicious. They are inspecting us because their process says to. People who follow a process trust the process. They do not look harder than the process requires." She was right. The Vorkai fleet spent 4 days in our outer system. scanned what was visible, which was orbital farms and light industrial activity in near-Earth space, and a Martian colony that had grown considerably but was producing exactly the kinds of atmospheric processing output that matched a civilizaton focused on local development and nothing else. They sent a brief report to their home system, which the HFY intercepted and shared with us within the week. The report said, Earth system shows standard post-contact development pattern, no military buildup detected, compliance maintained. Next inspection recommended in 25 years. I read that report alone, in my quarters on the frame, at 2 in the morning by Earth Standard Time. I read it twice. Then I walked down to Osei's office, where she was, as she often was, still at her desk. I said, they think we are farmers. She said, good. I said, 25 years. They will not look again for 25 years. She said, we will not need 25 years. In year 28, I was given the title of Admiral, which felt strange, since I had never commanded a ship in my life. Osei explained that what I commanded was more important than ships. I commanded the knowledge of what we had built, and what it could do, and how to use it. Ships needed that more than they needed another person who understood navigation. By year 30, the Allied Terran Coalition had 240 warships, 60 of which carried deep-land systems that the Vorkai had never seen, and had no defense against that we could identify. We had alliance commitments from the HFY, who had been quietly building their own capacity for 8 years with materials they had been diverting from Vorkai supply deliveries in amounts small enough not to trigger audit flags. We had the Orindi pilots and their knowledge of Vorkai space that was worth more than 100 additional ships. We had something else too. We had the children who had grown up memorizing star charts. They were 30 years old now, and they flew our ships and ran our systems and planned our operations with a kind of cold, complete focus that I think surprised even the people who had raised them with that purpose. They were not angry. They had never seen New Reykjavik as it had been. They had only grown up knowing what it had become, and what it had become was a reason, and reasons, when they are clear and they are just, do not burn out the way anger does. Osei called the first full war council in month 11 of year 30. She stood at the head of the table in the main command room of the frame, with the stars visible through the observation panels on 3 sides, and she told us it was time. She said she was going to speak to the Vorkai conclave directly before we moved. Some of the council members objected to this. They said it gave away our position. They said it gave the Empire time to prepare. She said, it gives them a chance. I am not interested in denying them a chance. I am interested in what they do with it. If they choose correctly, we stop here and build something better. If they do not choose correctly, then every neutral species in this galaxy will know, without any doubt, what the Vorkai are. And then what comes next will not only be justice, it will be witness justice, and that matters. No one at the table argued with her after that. Not because she had outranked them, because she was right, and they all knew it. She requested the audience with the Vorkai conclave the following morning. The request was transmitted through official channels, politely, in language that gave nothing away. It identified her as Supreme Commander of the Allied Terran Coalition of Earth, and asked for a formal diplomatic session at the convenience of the conclave. The conclave's reply arrived in 6 days. It granted the audience. The tone of the reply was amused, in the particular way that very large things are amused by very small things. I read it and felt nothing except the quiet certainty that in a short time, the Vorkai stellar empire was going to understand its mistake in a way that no amount of inspection reports or administrative procedures would ever let them undo. We had been building for 30 years. We were ready. The transmission room was smaller than I expected for a moment that would be remembered for the rest of history. It was a gray room, functional, full of equipment that hummed at a frequency you could feel in your back teeth if you stood still long enough. There were 6 of us besides General Osei, all of us there because we had specific technical roles, and not because anyone had thought to make the space dramatic. There were no windows. There was no ceremony. There was a chair, a table, a camera, and a connection running through 14 relay points to the Vorkai conclave chamber, which was, according to our intelligence, a large formal space on the Vorkai homeworld, built specifically for occasions when the Empire wished to receive submission from smaller civilizations. Osei sat down at the table, alone. She straightened her uniform once, with both hands. A single precise motion. She did not look at any of us. She placed a small data chip on the table in front of her, set it down flat, and then she looked at the camera and waited. The Vorkai conclave came on screen in segments, each section of the chamber appearing as a separate feed that our system assembled into a single wide image. There were 11 of them at the main table, all senior military commanders and administrative officials, wearing the layered gray garments that signified rank in their culture, and behind them were perhaps 40 more officials and aides arranged in a gallery. The chamber was large and formally lit. They had gone to some trouble with the setting, I realized. They wanted us to understand the difference in scale. The Vorkai who sat at the center of the table was an older male, broad across the shoulders, with the particular stillness that very powerful people in very powerful positions tend to develop. His name was Conclave Director Vethrak, and he was the highest administrative authority in the Empire outside of their ruling council. He looked at the camera with the expression of someone who has a great many things to do and has allocated a specific and limited amount of time for this one. He said, in their language, which our system translated in real time with a half-second delay, "We receive the representative of the Earth system. State your compliance terms." There was an assumption built into that sentence that I want you to understand. He did not ask whether we were there to discuss compliance. He assumed we were there to negotiate the details of it. 30 years had passed, and the Vorkai understanding of the situation had not moved one step from the day they filed their report after the inspection fleet came home. We were a compliant world that had been slow to formally confirm its compliance. We were here to confirm it. Osei said, "I am not here to discuss compliance." There was a pause, not a long one, but a pause that had not been expected. Vethrak said, "Clarify." Osei said, "I am here to offer the Vorkai Stellar Empire a single opportunity to make a choice. I will describe the choice clearly. I want there to be no misunderstanding, because this is the only time I will offer it." She picked up the data chip and held it so the camera could see it clearly. She said, "This chip contains the precise coordinates of every Vorkai military installation we have mapped in the past 30 years, all 3,417 of them. It also contains a detailed analysis of your current fleet disposition, your supply chain vulnerabilities, your patrol schedules, and the 17 specific points in your logistics network whose simultaneous disruption would reduce your military response capacity by approximately 60% within the first 90 hours of any conflict." The gallery behind the conclave table had gone very still. Vethrak said, "You are claiming to have conducted 30 years of military intelligence operations in Imperial space." Osei said, "I am not claiming it. I am showing you the results." She placed the chip back on the table, flat, with a small precise click. "The choice I am offering is this. The Vorkai Stellar Empire will stand down all military forces currently positioned in contested space within 72 hours. It will release all species currently held under absorption agreements who wish to renegotiate the terms of that arrangement. It will cede all exclusion zone territories beyond 100 light-years from your home system, and it will submit the officials responsible for the decision to strike New Reykjavik to an independent tribunal composed of neutral species representatives." She stopped. She let that sit. One of the other conclave members, a woman near the end of the table with a narrow face and very bright eyes, said something in a rapid undertone to the person beside her. Vethrak raised one hand briefly and she went quiet. Vethrak said, "You are one world. You have 12 billion people. We are 47 worlds. We have administered this region of space for 400 years. You are asking us to dismantle our territorial framework on the word of a single planet that has been in space for less than a century." Osei said, "No, I am not asking." There was a longer pause this time. I was watching her from the side of the room, and I want to tell you what she looked like in that moment, because I think it matters. She did not look angry. She did not look triumphant. She looked like someone who has prepared for a very long time for a very specific moment, and the moment has arrived, and everything is exactly where it should be, and now there is nothing to do but say the thing clearly, and let it be true. She said, 30 years ago, your ships came to a city called New Reykjavik. It was a city full of students and doctors and engineers and old people who fed the birds at the harbor in the morning. It was full of people who had never heard of the Vorkai and had never crossed into your space on purpose, and had never done anything to you at all. Your ships turned that city into a flat plain of burning stone in 90 seconds, and then your ships went home, and someone filed a report, and the report said that the demonstration had been successful and the matter was likely resolved. She stopped for a moment, not for effect, because she was making sure she had the words right. She said, "We did not surrender. We went quiet. While you were filing your reports and running your inspections and deciding that our silence meant compliance, we were building something you have no framework to understand, because you have never encountered a species that responded to what you did the way we responded. Every species you have done this to before accepted because the alternative was more destruction, and they chose to protect their people. We understand that choice, we do not judge it, but we made a different one." She leaned forward slightly. She said, "You hit Earth first. That was your right, by your rules, in your space, in your understanding of how things work. But this is our understanding of how things work. You do not get to burn a city full of people who were feeding birds, and filing no reports, and going home from work, and calling it a measured response, and then go home, and wait for compliance, and then get compliance. That is not how it ends. Not with us. We are coming. All of us. Every ship we have built and every alliance we have made, and every person who grew up knowing your star charts because they were raised with a single purpose that has never changed in 30 years. We are coming, and we have spent 30 years thinking about nothing else. And I need you to understand that the 72 hours I am offering you is not a delay. It is a gift, and I am only giving it once." The room was completely silent. Vethrak looked at her for a long time. He looked at the data chip on the table. He looked back at her. He said, "You are one world." Osei said, "Today, yes." She reached out and disconnected the feed. The screen went blank. The hum of the equipment continued. None of us in the room said anything for a moment. Then Colin Price, who had been standing near the door and who had been with Osei since New Reykjavik, let out a breath that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh, and he said, very quietly, "Well, now we find out." Osei stood up from the chair. She picked up the data chip and put it in her pocket. She looked around the room at each of us, the same way she had looked around that temporary command center in the cargo facility 30 years ago, seeing each of us rather than just the space we occupied. She said, "Get some sleep. Whatever they decide, the next 72 hours are the last quiet ones for a while." She walked out. The door closed behind her. I stayed in the room for a little longer than the others, standing in front of the blank screen where the conclave chamber had been, thinking about 11 senior officials sitting in a formally lit room built to receive surrender, and what they were saying to each other right now, and what they were going to do. I thought about the Shen Vak, who had spent 80 years cataloging supply chain vulnerabilities and waiting. I thought about the Orindi pilots, who knew the gaps in Vorkai patrol coverage, the way I knew the hallways of the frame. I thought about 240 ships sitting dark and quiet in the asteroid belt, and 60 deeplant systems that the Vorkai had no entry for in any of their tactical databases, because we had never used one, and they had never seen one, and their process had no category for a thing that did not exist in their intelligence files. I thought about the students and the doctors and the engineers and the old people feeding birds at the harbor in the morning. I turned off the light when I left. The Vorkai did not use 72 hours. They used 14. 14 hours after Osei's transmission ended, their response arrived. Not through diplomatic channels, not through the formal connection we had established for the audience, through the direct military frequency they had used 30 years ago when they announced the strike on New Reykjavik, because the message was the same kind as that one. 3 Vorkai cruisers had entered our outer system and struck the colony station on Ganymede. The station had held 1,100 people. It had been one of our quieter facilities, officially listed as an atmospheric research outpost. It was not, but what it looked like from outside was exactly that, which was why it had not been moved when we heard the inspection fleet was coming 23 years ago. 840 people survived because the station had been built with the kind of redundant shelter systems that we had been installing in all our outer facilities for the past 15 years. Not because we expected to be attacked, but because Osei had a policy that everything we built should assume the worst possible external conditions at all times. 840 people survived, 260 did not. I heard the news in my quarters, and I sat on the edge of my bunk, and I put my hands on my knees, and I stayed there for a moment that I could not time, because I had stopped thinking about time. Then I got up and went to the command room. Osei was already there. She had been there, I think, since before the news came in, because she had known it was coming. Not the specific target, and not the specific number, but the fact of it. She had told me once, in year 22, that she expected the Vorkai to strike again before we moved, because their process required it. She had said that when someone whose process has always worked encounters a situation where the process is not working, their first response is not to question the process. Their first response is to apply more process. She was standing at the main display, looking at the tactical map of our solar system with the 3 Vorkai cruisers marked in red. They had not left after the strike. They were holding position in the outer system, which meant either they were waiting for orders, or they believed we had nothing capable of threatening them there. They were wrong about the second thing, Osei said, without turning from the map. How long to get the outer wing into position? Lieutenant Commander Nadia Holt, who was running tactical operations, said, 40 minutes. Osei said, do it, and broadcast to every frequency the Shenvake gave us. Every neutral species in range. I want witnesses. Holt said, broadcasting the engagement? Osei said, broadcasting everything. From now on, everything is open. Every decision, every action, every result. They made their choice in front of the galaxy by hitting Ganymede 14 hours after I gave them 72 hours. Now the galaxy watches what we do with it. This was, I realized as she said it, part of the plan. Not the specific 14-hour figure, but the principle. Whatever the Vorkai did in those 72 hours would define them to every watching species. If they chose correctly, we would have peace and witnesses. If they chose wrong, every neutral civilization within broadcast range would see it happen in real time, and then they would see what came after, and what came after would define us. The outer wing engaged the 3 Vorkai cruisers at 43 minutes past the hour. I want to be careful about how I describe this, because I am not a pilot, and I am not a weapons officer, and what I understand is strategy and patterns, and the shape of systems, not the specific mechanics of what happens when 2 opposing forces meet in the vacuum of space. What I can tell you is what I saw on the display, and what I saw was something I had never seen in any Vorkai engagement record in the 30 years I had been studying them. The Vorkai fought according to doctrine. Their doctrine was excellent. It had been developed over 4 centuries of expansion, and refined through dozens of engagements, and it was built on the assumption that superior firepower deployed in superior numbers, and coordinated through a precise command structure, would produce a predictable outcome. Their doctrine was, by any reasonable measure, correct. It was correct for every engagement they had ever fought. It was not correct for this one. The outer wing did not engage them the way their doctrine expected. It did not match their formation, or respond to their opening movements the way their tactical models predicted. It split immediately into 3 separate elements that moved independently of each other, each one responding to the positions of the other 2 in real time, without any central command coordination. Because we had spent 8 years developing a distributed decision system that allowed individual ship captains to act on shared information, without waiting for orders. The Vorkai command structure was centralized because centralization had always been the most reliable system for their kind of engagement. Centralization, against a distributed response system, meant that every Vorkai command decision took slightly longer than every human response decision. Not much longer, but in space, slightly longer is a measurement that accumulates very quickly. The Deep Lance units fired at 11 minutes into the engagement. I watched the display and I understood, from the way the 3 Vorkai cruiser markers responded, that they had no countermeasure prepared. The Deep Lance was not faster than their existing defensive systems. It was not more powerful in the conventional sense. It combined 4 existing technologies in a sequence their defensive protocols did not have a category for, and so their defensive protocols did not activate in response to it, because their protocols were built to recognize threat signatures, and this signature was not in the registry. 2 of the 3 cruisers were disabled within 20 minutes. The third, the command ship, turned and ran. Osei said, "Let it go." Captain Frank Adler, commanding the outer wing from his ship, said, through the comm, "I can intercept it before it clears the system." Osei said, I know you can. Let it go. There was a pause. Then Adler said, "Understood." The command cruiser cleared our system and jumped. It was carrying its crew and its commander, and all of their sensor data, from a 14-minute engagement with a human force that had behaved in ways their tactical database did not contain. Osei turned to face the room. She said, "That ship is the most important thing we sent into Vorkai space today. It is going to reach a Vorkai command center, and it is going to deliver a report. And that report is going to say things that the Vorkai conclave does not have a framework to process. It will tell them that we engaged their cruisers with a distributed response system they have never seen. It will tell them that we used a weapon that bypassed their standard defenses. It will tell them that we let their ship run." She said, "Fear is what happens when a process fails, and there is no substitute process available. We just removed their substitute process. 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 What is left is fear, and fear inside a centralized command structure is the most destabilizing force in any military system, because it paralyzes decision-making at exactly the level where decision-making matters most." Over the next 19 days, the opening phase of what came to be called the Terran campaign was executed across 19 Vorkai systems simultaneously. Not in sequence, not as an advancing front. Simultaneously, in a coordinated action that the Vorkai command structure, designed to respond to threats sequentially and centrally, had no protocol for managing at that scale. Shenvac technical operatives disabled Vorkai supply relays at 4 critical junction points during the same 19-day window, using the vulnerabilities they had cataloged over 40 years. Orindi pilots, who knew Vorkai patrol routes better than the patrol ships themselves, guided our strike elements through the gaps in coverage. I will not describe the full campaign here, because what matters is not the mechanical sequence of engagements, but the thing that the engagements proved over and over in those 19 days, and in the weeks that followed. What they proved was something that Osei had understood from the first moment, and that I had come to understand over 30 years, and that the Vorkai, despite 400 years of expansion, had never had an opportunity to learn. Humans fight when they are scared. Humans adapt when they are losing. Humans continue when they have lost things that should, by any reasonable calculation, have ended their capacity to continue. This is not a virtue in the comfortable sense. It is something stranger than that. It is a quality that emerges from a species that has spent most of its history in conditions of genuine uncertainty, where the next season was not guaranteed, and the next generation was not guaranteed, and nothing could be taken as settled or permanent. The Vorkai had spent 400 years taking things as settled and permanent. They had built a command structure, and a military doctrine, and a process for absorbing civilizations, all of which rested on the assumption that the universe was a stable and predictable place where the same approaches produced the same results. We had grown up in a universe that was not like that at all. On day 22, a Vorkai fleet of 40 ships came to engage our main force directly, the largest single Vorkai commitment of the campaign. Our force was smaller. Osei did not attempt to match their formation. She split our fleet into 4 independent groups and sent them in 4 different directions, each group targeting a different Vorkai supply line rather than engaging the fleet itself. The Vorkai fleet spent 11 hours trying to decide which group to pursue and which to ignore. By the time they committed to a direction, 2 of our groups had already completed their objectives and were repositioning. The Vorkai admiral commanding that fleet was a capable officer by any measure. He made reasonable decisions. He was simply making reasonable decisions in a situation that had been designed to make reasonable decisions insufficient. Colin Price told me later that he felt some sympathy for that, and I understood what he meant, and I agreed with him, and neither of us said so in the command room, because it was not the time for it. On day 31, Osei did the thing that surprised even me. A Vorkai cruiser had been badly damaged in an engagement near the system boundary and was drifting without power. It had enough life support for perhaps 6 hours. It was a military vessel, and its crew had fired on our ships, and 3 of our people had been hurt in that engagement. There was no tactical reason to assist it. There was no strategic reason to assist it. There were excellent reasons, in the logic of a military campaign, not to. Osei dispatched a rescue crew. Captain Adler said, Over the comm. General, that is a functioning enemy vessel. If we restore their power. Ose said, it is a vessel full of people who are going to run out of air. Send the rescue crew. Adler said, our people are going to be at risk during the boarding. OCA said, I know, send them anyway. The rescue crew boarded. The Vorkai crew of 31 were transferred to our medical facility and treated and held as the first official prisoners of the campaign. Their ship was taken as a prize. The entire action was broadcast on the open frequencies that Ose had established on day 1. Afterward, I asked her why. I said I understood the humanitarian case, but I wanted to know the strategic calculation, because I knew there was one. She said, because in 30 years, when someone writes the history of this war, I do not want there to be a moment where the answer to what we did was the same thing they did to us. We are not fighting to become what they are. We are fighting to prove that it is possible to be something else, and still win. The rescue was not the compassionate choice. The rescue was the correct choice. There is no difference. Then she said, also, when the 31 survivors go home eventually and tell people what happened to them, that matters too. Do not discount the power of a story told by someone who expected to die and didn't. She was right about that as well. She was right about most things. I have spent a long time thinking about the cases where she was uncertain, and I have found very few of them, and in the ones I have found, she was uncertain for the right reasons. The campaign continued. The Vorkai adapted, but slowly, because adaptation in a centralized system is expensive and visible, and the Shenvok could see every major command decision through the supply chain disruptions they were maintaining. We knew what the Empire was adjusting before the adjustments were implemented. We knew where the next defensive concentration would be before the ships arrived there. Information, gathered over 30 years of careful and patient work, was the weapon that mattered more than any vessel we had built. I did not sleep more than 4 hours at a stretch for the next 60 days. I did not mind. The end of the Vorkai stellar empire did not look like what I had imagined. I had spent 30 years imagining it in my quieter moments, the way you imagine any conclusion to something that has occupied most of your adult life. I had imagined a final confrontation, a decisive engagement, a moment of absolute clarity where the outcome was settled in a single event, and everyone on both sides understood simultaneously that it was over. That is how it happens in the stories people tell afterward. The clean line, the turning point, the last stand. The actual end looked nothing like that. It looked like a communication I received on day 78 of the campaign from a Shenvok intelligence contact, routed through the network they had been running for 3 decades. The communication said that 3 of the outer worlds of the Vorkai Empire, systems on the far edge of their territory that had been part of the Empire for less than a century, and had always been administered more loosely than the core worlds, had sent separate formal notices to the Conclave, declaring that they were suspending military cooperation with the Imperial fleet, and entering into independent negotiations with the allied Terran coalition. They had watched 61 days of open broadcasts. They had watched a force smaller than anything the Empire had fielded engage multiple Vorkai fleets and not lose. They had watched a rescue. They had watched the Conclave's responses, which had been increasingly inconsistent and increasingly delayed, because fear inside a centralized command structure paralyzes decision-making, and the Empire was paralyzed. They had looked at their own situation and made a calculation, and the calculation said that the Empire they had joined for protection was no longer providing protection, and was no longer capable of providing it in any foreseeable future. They were the first 3. Within the next 12 days, 9 more worlds sent similar notices. The Conclave could not respond effectively to this, because responding effectively would have required redirecting military resources from the active campaign, which was already consuming everything they could commit. Every move they made to address the internal fracturing weakened their position against us. Every additional commitment to the campaign against us accelerated the internal fracturing. They were caught in a spiral that their process had no procedure for, because their process had never needed one. Their empire had never fractured before. Worlds did not leave. Things did not unravel. The process prevented that. The process was gone. On day 91, Director Vethrak requested a communication with General Ose. I was in the transmission room again when the feed came up. The same gray room, the same hum at the back of the teeth. Ose at the same table. But the image on screen was different this time. Vethrak was alone. No gallery of officials, no formal chamber. He was in what looked like a private office, and he looked like a man who had not slept in several weeks. He said, "The conclave wishes to discuss terms." Osei said, "I know." He said, "We request an immediate ceasefire while negotiations proceed." She said, "No." He said, "You are asking us to negotiate under active military pressure." She said, "Yes, because the last time I gave you 72 hours to make a choice, you used 14 of them to hit Ganymede. I do not have evidence that additional time produces better choices from the conclave, and I am not willing to test the hypothesis. The military operation continues until a formal agreement is signed. It does not continue after." There was a very long pause. Vethrak said, "What are your terms?" Osei said, "Full disarmament of all Vorkai fleets, in contested space, within 30 days of signing. Release of all absorption agreements to independent renegotiation, with no coercion and no penalty for species that choose to exit. Cession of all exclusion zone territories beyond 75 light-years from your home system. Establishment of an independent tribunal with neutral species membership to adjudicate the new Reykjavik strike and all subsequent actions." She said, "The tribunal is not negotiable. Nothing else in that list is significantly negotiable, but the tribunal is the one I will walk away from this conversation over if it is not accepted." Vethrak said, "You are asking us to submit our own officials to judgment by outside parties." She said, "Yes, that is what accountability looks like. You destroyed a city of 4 million people. You did it based on a file about a probe that crossed a line that was not marked and that we did not know existed. Someone decided that was a reasonable response. That person, or those people, need to be held to account by a process that is not administered by the people who made the decision. That is not a punitive demand. It is the minimum requirement for anything that happens after this to mean something." She said, "You have been administering this region of space for 400 years, based on the assumption that you are the final authority on what is reasonable and what is not. That assumption was always incorrect. It is more clearly incorrect now. The tribunal is the first step toward a different arrangement, one where no single empire decides for everyone what a measured response looks like." The negotiation that followed lasted 19 days. I was present for all of it, not as a negotiator but as the person who held the complete picture in my head, and could tell Osei when something in the proposed language deviated from what our intelligence indicated was actually enforceable. There were moments that were difficult. There were moments where Vorkai representatives pushed on specific points in ways that required patience and care, and a willingness to say the same thing multiple times in different language until it was understood. There were moments where I thought it was going to collapse, and there were moments where I thought it was going to conclude faster than it did. At no point did Osei show anything other than steady, precise, unhurried determination. She never raised her voice. She never made a threat she had not already demonstrated the capacity to carry out. She never asked for anything she had not already decided was necessary and just. The Vorkai negotiators were, I think, expecting someone different. They were expecting either rage or magnanimity, the two modes in which they had experience with defeated opponents. Osei was neither. She was simply exact. The Terran Accord was signed on day 112 of the campaign, in a ceremony conducted simultaneously on the frame and in the Vorkai administrative capital via secure two-way broadcast. Osei signed for the Allied Terran Coalition. A Vorkai official named Councillor Dreen Ovas signed for the Conclave. Ovas had been one of the voices in the Conclave who had argued against the Ganymede strike, I later learned, and had been overruled, and had spent the following 3 months watching the consequences of that decision unfold. He signed the document with the deliberate care of someone who understood exactly what they were doing and was choosing it. I am told the ceremony was broadcast across every Shenvak and Orindi channel, and through the network of neutral species receivers that OCA had been cultivating for 3 years, as the preparation for the campaign moved into its final phase. I am told that the broadcast reached approximately 40 inhabited systems, representing perhaps 230 billion individuals, and that in the days that followed, the communications our coalition received from species who had previously maintained strict neutrality shifted significantly in tone and content. What changed was not that they suddenly agreed with us about everything. What changed was that they had watched us fight, and they had watched us win, and they had watched what we did with the winning. They had watched Ose let a ship run to carry fear home. They had watched a rescue crew board a drifting enemy vessel and bring the crew to safety. They had watched negotiations conducted without revenge, and without cruelty, and without the particular satisfaction of making a defeated opponent publicly humiliate themselves, which had been standard Vorkai practice in all their previous absorption agreements. They had watched a species that had every right to be brutal, choose not to be. Not because it lacked the capacity, but because the person making the decisions had decided, 30 years before and many times since, that what you build after a war matters more than what you destroy during it. I flew back to Earth with Ose in the week after the signing. It was the first time I had been home in 4 years. We came in over the Atlantic in the late afternoon, and the light on the water was the kind of light that has no name in any language I know, somewhere between gold and gray, and very clear. We did not talk much on the flight. There was not much to say that had not already been said, or that could not wait. New Reykjavik had been rebuilt, not on the same plan as the original city, because the people who rebuilt it had decided that rebuilding it exactly the same would be a kind of denial, a pretense that what had happened could be undone rather than answered. The new city was larger in some places and smaller in others, and it had a memorial district at its southern edge, where the crater of the old market had been, and the memorial district was not a monument in the traditional sense. It was a neighborhood. People lived in it. There were apartments and small businesses and a library and a school. The idea, I was told, had come from a group of survivors who had argued that the best possible memorial to the people who had been lost was to fill the space where they were lost with more life. The memorial itself was a low circular structure at the center of the district, open to the sky, with the names of the people who had died on the interior walls. Not just the names from the initial strike, all of them, from every event of the 30-year campaign that had followed. Ose asked the driver to stop near the entrance. She got out. I followed her. It was a cold morning, clear, with the smell of the sea. We walked into the memorial and stood in the center of it, and she walked slowly around the interior, looking at the names. She did not say anything. She had been doing that, in my experience, when something mattered to her most. She went quiet, and she looked, really looked, the way she had looked at the rubble of the original city on that first day, when she had stood still for 12 seconds, and then said 4 words that had started everything. She stopped walking after a while. She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket and took out a photograph, small and worn at the edges, the kind that had been printed on physical paper when printing on paper was still common. She set it at the base of the wall, leaning against the stone. I was close enough to see it. It was a picture of a woman I did not recognize, middle-aged and laughing at something outside the frame, standing in front of a window that looked out over water. I did not ask. She would tell me if she wanted to tell me, and if she did not, then it was hers, and it belonged to her, and to this wall, and that was enough. We stood there for a little while longer. The cold morning continued to be cold. Somewhere in the memorial district, in one of the apartments or the school or the small businesses that filled the space where a crater used to be, a door opened and closed, and footsteps went past on a stone path, and a voice, a child's voice, called out something that I could not quite hear clearly from where I was standing, but that sounded like a name. Ose looked up at the open sky above the memorial for a moment. Then she turned and we walked back to the car. That night, in a hotel room in the new city, I wrote up the final report of the campaign for the Allied Terran Coalition Council, the one that would go into the permanent record and be read by historians and analysts for as long as the record survived. I wrote about the 30 years of preparation and the alliances and the tactics and the Terran Accord and the tribunal that was already beginning its work. I wrote about the Shenvak and the Orindi and the neutral species and what the campaign had meant for the balance of relationships in our region of the galaxy. I wrote about the ships and the strategies and the specific engagements and what they had demonstrated about human adaptability and distributed decision-making under pressure. Then I stopped and looked at what I had written, and I thought about what it did not say, and I added one more section. I wrote that the Vorkai had hit Earth first. I wrote that they had done it with the confidence of a civilization that had done the same thing many times and understood the likely outcome. I wrote that they had been wrong, Not because they had miscalculated the military balance, which they had, and not because they had underestimated our capacity for preparation and alliance building, which they had, but because they had not understood something about the species they had struck that was not in any of their files, and not the kind of thing that shows up in an inspection report. I wrote that humanity is not the oldest species in our region of the galaxy, and not the largest, and not the most technologically advanced in the absolute measure of things. But humanity is the one species in the recorded history of this part of the galaxy that has been struck at the moment of its first real contact with another civilization, struck hard and deliberately, and responded by going quiet for 30 years and building something that had never existed before, and then coming back. Not as conquerors, that was the important part. We came back with a tribunal. We came back with an accord. We came back having rescued people who had fired on us, and having broadcast everything we did, and having chosen, at every decision point where brutality was available and justified, to do something else. I wrote that this was not weakness. I wrote that anyone who looked at the last 112 days of the campaign and believed that they were looking at the actions of a species that did not know how to be strong was misreading the evidence. I wrote that what they were actually looking at was a species that knew precisely how strong it was and had decided, very deliberately, what to do with that strength and what not to do with it. I wrote that the galaxy had spent 400 years watching the Vorkai expand and absorb and demonstrate, and it had understood something from that watching, which was that power was the final answer to everything. I wrote that it had just watched 31 days of broadcast and seen something different. I saved the report and sent it. Then I turned off the light and lay down on the bed and looked at the ceiling in the dark, and I thought about New Reykjavik as it had been, and as it had become, and about a child's voice calling out a name somewhere in a neighborhood that had been built in a crater, and about a photograph leaning against a wall, and about Mara Osei standing in a cargo facility 30 years ago saying, in her quiet voice, that we were going to do something different. We did. We always come back. That is the thing about humans that no one, not the Vorkai, not the galaxy, not even us sometimes, ever quite remembers in time.